across the southeast were waterlogged.
Yes, Greens Lord Mayoral candidate Jonathan Sriranganathan is using the anniversary to make a key election promise. Good morning, Jonathan. Thanks for coming in.
Morning, thanks for having me.
What are you announcing today?
Basically, a ban on new development in the most flood-prone parts of the city. So we have a problem in Brisbane where developers who should be building on higher ground, close to public transport hubs where we really need new housing, are instead buying really cheap blocks of land down on the floodplain, you know, the old warehouses of Milton and West End, and cramming in high density development in these areas. And that basically sets future residents up for failure. So developers sell them, they take their money and run, and then 5, 10, 20, 50 years down the track, it's residents, body corporates, and sometimes local councils that are dealing with the ongoing costs of rising insurance, the disruption of periodic floods. And our concern is that climate change means flooding could get more severe in the future. So even areas that only flood a little bit right now could be flooding a lot worse in a few decades.
Yeah, because the problem is Brisbane is basically built on a floodplain, isn't it?
Well, I kind of disagree. We say that a lot, but actually only about 10% of Brisbane's urban footprint is flood prone. The other 90% is up on the hills, but we keep building so much high density development on that 10% that's really flood prone, and that's reinforcing the city's vulnerabilities.
You've mentioned Milton, West End in talking there. Are they the main areas? Where else are you focusing this on?
Basically all the suburbs that residents would know flood really badly. So places like Newstead, parts of Albion, parts of Hurston, Yeronga, Rockley, of course. These are the areas that flood really badly. So there are other areas of the city that flood a little bit where you can get away with raising homes, designing flood resilient buildings. But in these areas where the flood water is particularly deep and fast, we're saying don't build there anymore. Let's turn that into public green space, sports fields, native bushland, urban farmland. We should not be housing more people on these areas because it's setting them up for failure.
Yeah, the flood resilient idea was really, I suppose, talked about, and in response to recommendations of the 2022 flood review, the council focused on developing those flood resilient suburbs. What about the homes, though, that are there now and that have made their homes resilient?
Yeah, so our proposal today isn't going to affect existing owners. It's not going to stop people from raising up existing homes to get them above the flood level or to renovate them in other ways to make them more flood resilient. It's specifically targeting new developments, because what we're seeing is that developers are making massive profits by building on these floodplains, and they're not having to deal with the long-term consequences.
But could they still build there if they raise them and make them flood resilient?
Yeah, in those areas where the flood risk is a little bit lower, yes. And we're saying they just need to build 2 meters above the peak flood levels. But as I was the city councillor in West End back in 2022, and what we saw was that even when the apartments themselves are above the flood level, if your basement car park, your elevator shaft, all your road access, your garbage collection areas are all going underwater, that still has a really significant impact on the city. And right now there's maybe 20, 30,000 people living in these really vulnerable areas. If we continue putting more people down there and suddenly there's 100,000 people who every time there's a flood, they lose garbage, they lose power, they lose access, that starts to have a really big impact on the functioning of the city. So yeah, no, in these particular areas, the flood risk is so severe and the water gets so high that we shouldn't be putting anyone there. We should be going for green space.
7:22 on ABC Radio. Brisbane Greens Lord Mayoral candidate Jonathan Sriranganathan is using the anniversary of the February 22 floods, the second anniversary, to make this promise about banning development in flood-prone areas.
Well, given that there's the housing crisis at the moment, and you talk about the people being displaced obviously in times of flood, but there is also the question of finding places to live at the moment. So thousands of people flocking to Brisbane, looking for places. These places are suddenly off the board for them. What's the plan there?
Yeah, and to be clear, we're only talking about banning development in floodplain in areas 1 and 2. So there are lots of parts of the city that flood a little bit where we'd still allow flood resilient design. But like I said, there are lots of parts of the city that don't flood at all. I'm thinking about major areas around public transport hubs. I can point to big chunks of Ipswich Road through Woolloongabba where we could see more development. Obviously, the Greens have previously floated the idea of even shutting down one of the race courses and building housing on there. There are actually lots of large sites where we could build new development. The problem is that if we leave it up to private developers, they just want to build wherever the land is cheapest and wherever it's most profitable. And so we shouldn't be leaving these urban planning decisions up to the private sector. We need to be setting some limits. And the former Deputy Premier, now Premier, he said this after the 22 floods. He said we need to be reviewing our city plan guidelines to restrict new development in these most flood-prone areas. But after 2022, they didn't make any significant changes to city plans. So both the Liberal National Party at the council level and the Labor state government have actually recently approved the Kurilpa TLPI, which is going to allow more high-density development down on the West End floodplain on sites that no one ever built housing before because it was so flood-prone. They left it as farmland and then warehouses because they knew it was a bad place to build housing. Yet now the council wants to allow more housing on this floodland.
I'm going to throw up a question about Toombul, actually,
Yeah.
because it's close to my heart. Obviously, development needs to be done there. Nothing's happening at the moment. It's about to be demolished. Someone's thrown up a conversation about housing. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Toombul's a good example of a site where on the lower side, the most flood-prone land, that should be turned into green space and we can expand that creek catchment a little bit. And on the higher ground, you could build medium density housing and shops. So shops for 1 or 2 levels and then housing above. And that's probably a good use of that site because it's close to public transport. So it's just about balance and making sure we are designing with flooding in mind rather than sticking our heads in the sand and pretending that the city's not going to flood again in future.
And just to clarify, so all new developments, and that includes a new home with a flood-proof plan, basically. If you want to build something new, you want to flood-proof it, that's off the table?
Just in floodplain areas 1 and 2, the most vulnerable parts of the city. Floodplain areas 3, 4, 5, you're fine to build as long as you raise it at least 2 meters above the flood levels.
Okay, Jonathan Sranganathan, thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.